Hi, and welcome to the Anti-Waffle podcast with me, Bellshaw-Naylor, and Marva Gregorio de Souza.
Hello.
And together we will try to talk about research without any gobbledygook. Each episode we'll be talking to a researcher who will discuss the work they're doing, look at why this research is important, and asking how the hell did they get into this field. We hope that it will be informative and interesting and bring a bit of the academic world into the real world. This week we have Professor Helen Chatterjee, based at University College London. Great. Well, thank you very much for being here. Do you want to give us an overview of your research at UCL?
Sure, thanks for having me. So I'm a biologist, a professor of biology in the UCL Biosciences division, and I'm really a primatologist. So I've worked for 20 years on small apes, called Gibbons, from Southeast Asia. They're distributed across the whole of Southeast Asia and have quite a broad distribution. But like many biologists, particularly people who focus on ecology, a lot of my work more recently is really focused on the issues of biodiversity loss. So gibbons, small apes, are one of the world's most endangered mammals. The world's rarest mammal is a gibbon. It lives on Hainan Island, just south of China. There's only about 25, less than 30 individuals left. So we're talking really, really rare species.
Wow.
So when you say biodiversity loss, does that mean extinction? Is that another way of saying it?
Yeah, well, it's the factors leading to extinction.
Right.
So what we're talking about is massive species decline on a global scale, both local, regional and internationally. So all gibbon species apart from one, there are 19 species of gibbon recognised. All of them apart from one are critically endangered or endangered. And what that means is there are populations that are surviving at really, really small numbers, to the point where they are going to be extinct within probably quite short periods of time. So for example, the Hainan gibbon is really not surviving at a population threshold that is viable. The family groups that exist, these 25 individuals, are reproducing, but at very, very low rates. So we're not seeing population expansion in a way that would impact factors relating to extinction. So, i.e., they probably will become extinct. There are people on the ground trying to stop that happening, but they are effectively what you might describe as extinct already, because they are not really viable as a population.
Right. Wow. So what's causing it?
So there's two main drivers. It's all human impact, anthropogenic impacts. The biggest impact is habitat loss. So if anybody saw the Red Ape documentary last night about orangutans, pretty much all animals and plants that are endangered or critically endangered are facing the same problem, which is massive loss of natural habitat. And mostly that is habitats being converted into farmland, agricultural land. So the biggest problem in Southeast Asia, the biggest problem affecting things like gibbons and orangutans, is conversion of primary and secondary pristine forest into oil palm plantations. And the biggest issue we have there, and things like rubber, coffee plantations, meat consumption, all of that is fat. All of those products are consumed on huge scales. So there's huge global demand for these resources.
Is there any way to reverse, to save these gibbons? Or is it too late for this species?
So this particular species, habitat loss has been a big driver in terms of the numbers that exist at the minute. There's also big issues with things like hunting and poaching. A lot of that can be, say, for traditional medicines, it might be for meat, bush meat, but all of these factors combined mean that populations are just reducing. So you might have hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals in the space of a very small amount of time, year or 2 years, 3 years, really being reduced on massive scales. The biggest issue in Southeast Asia is oil palm. Because the palm oil is found in pretty much all food products, in toiletry products, in makeup, it's everywhere. And at the minute for consumers, they don't really know that. It's relatively new to light for your average consumer. And people don't know what it's in. But if you just go to your supermarket tomorrow and look at every single product that's in your basket, pretty much every one of them that isn't a raw food, natural food, will have palm oil in it. Whether it's jams, whether it's biscuits, whether it's crisps, whether it's... so it's basically the cheapest fat that you can add to a product. Whether it's bread, it's in everything. And all of your toiletries, whether it's shampoo, whether it's body lotion, whether it's lipstick.
Yeah, because a couple of years ago I became vegan, and I thought, oh, I've got to give up this, I've got to give up this, and give up. And then it was surprising the amount of products that I didn't have to give up, especially the cheap products like cheap biscuits, like because of course they don't have butter in, they've got the palm oil in, and it's like, I see people say, oh, but you shouldn't have palm oil because it's, all the Gibbons are dying, all the monkeys are dying, and it's taken up their territory. And I can't give up everything. And then is
there substitutes that you can?
Well, that's the biggest issue at the minute. There isn't really, because it's so cheap, and the demand for it is far outstripping the demand for other products. So these producers, bearing in mind that a lot of the land that they are, mostly what they do is slash and burn, so you'll see pictures of burning gibbons, burning orangutans, and so on a massive scale, so acres and acres at a time, these big multinational corporations, multi-billion-pound industries that are able to go into forests and clear them at huge, very, very rapid rates. And they use what you might have heard of at school, the slash and burn, which is, chopping down or burning is the fastest way to get rid of forest. And these animals are completely and utterly reliant on the forest for their food, for the habitat where they live in the trees, so they simply cannot survive without it. And
so is your research to look at what the effects on the gibbons, but is it also to educate people about what's happening and how to help them, or what to stop it happening in other species? Most of my research is at the kind of understanding what those drivers are, so what understanding these factors we've just been talking about, and what impact that has in particular at kind of local and regional levels. So what sort of numbers are we losing? How rapidly do we lose them? How have their ranges changed over time? And I do that both in the present day, but I also look back in the past and see how species responded to environmental change and impacts in the past. So everything from the fossil record through into more historical times. So when do we start seeing the big changes in these ranges happening? And it really is what is now known as the Anthropocene, which is recent times, in the last kind of 100 years or so, where population growth has been exponential, it's really huge, and economically people are much richer. There might be a greater divide between the rich and the poor, but economically there's greater demand and consumerism related to products which are unfortunately reliant on natural habitat destruction.
Right.
So what I do is really look at all those different factors, and also I do looking at what's going to happen in the future. So if we were to predict when our species, like this particular species of gibbon, going to disappear, what is that going to look like? What's the time scale look like? Geographically, what's it going to look like? What are the areas that are going to be most threatened? And so there's various types of environmental modelling that you can do to see how species are distributed geographically. Right. But a lot of it is about public engagement. It's about engaging people with the really big issue that we all know as biologists. This is a massive global issue, but unfortunately, because it's linked to products and resources that consumers are buying it every single day, and there's billions of consumers buying them. It's it's a massive international issue.
And I guess it's difficult as well because what would our world look like if there were no gibbons? I know all we'd be losing is a certain richness of nature, but our lives will carry on, and I guess that's why it's difficult to get governments to listen and to get corporations to stop.
It's money as well, isn't it? That's the corporation side. I suppose if you can highlight what happens in one species, show what could happen to other species, and where do you stop?
You're absolutely right, and it's about valuing nature, as you say, in that generally, most people are very far removed from a tropical rainforest or natural habitats, and that's the biggest problem with global population growth. What we see is humans expanding into areas that are now encroaching onto natural habitats, and we see conflict there, but also the demand, like you say. So these are big multinational corporations that are delivering products that people want. That happen to threaten natural habitats, but most people are not. Most people don't have the opportunity to live in those natural habitats. Those populations that still do live in natural habitats, so usually localised, indigenous, very small populations that they themselves have been reduced in size due to exactly the same pressures. they have found ways of living sustainably with the environment. But what we know is that those populations survive in harmony with nature because they have natural population growth and natural sustainable approaches to resource use. So what they are doing is looking at their environment and thinking about, well, we can't overexploit this, because if we do that this year, whether it's, you know, a particular river or pond or wherever they're getting their natural resources from, if we overexploit this now, in a year's time or 5 years' time or 10 years' time, our children or grandchildren aren't going to be able to have these resources. So some human populations, very, very small human populations, have worked out how to live environmentally, sustainably, but unfortunately we haven't. And, you know, the West is the biggest problem.
Right.
And, well, emerging economies, so basically Europe, the US, China.
So would the idea be to boycott the palm oil, isn't it, palm oil products? But that's what you would need people to do en masse, but that's from what you're saying, that's going to be quite difficult.
What now we're sort of moving towards is this idea of trying to source only. So, for example, Iceland have just come out and said we will only...
This is the company, not the country.
Yeah, sorry. Iceland are quite important. So consumers can apply pressure to their local supermarkets or their favourite products. Johnson & Johnson, we're not giving adverts here because actually they're not. They have, so having a sustainable palm oil production is increasingly recognised as the best way to go, recognising that it is a cheap, you know, useful product. So how can we make sure that it's included in products that consumers want to buy, that, for example, aren't 10 times more expensive, because that instantly means that it's not going to be popular to consumers. And that's where pressurising supermarkets or particular brands to only use sustainable palm oil. So, for example, when you're looking at products now, you will be able to find some products that say only made with certified sustainable palm oil.
Yes,
there is a whole load of issue around what that really means, but we won't even go to, there's lots of, you know, politics about what does that mean, and there's issues with, it's quite easy for companies, I won't mention those companies' names, who've said, you know, for several years now we're using sustainable palm oil, and actually when you look into it we know they're not.
Right.
So that certification process is still an issue. But this is what we as consumers can do at the purchasing end, is, you know, really look at, try and avoid it, put pressure on the products and the brands that you want to buy from, and only try and source products that are as environmentally friendly as possible. Right. But yeah, it's really difficult.
Yes.
I was going to say, I see that you're sitting on the executive committee for the conservation of small apes. Is that a group that's sort of trying to drive us forward? So
the International Union for the Conservation of Nature is the sort of international body that kind of sets standards. It does environmental monitoring, species monitoring, and it has specialist groups that really focus in on particular areas of concern across biodiversity. So our group is focused on gibbons, the small apes. We're part of a larger primate specialist group, and that's what our job is. We're just a group of, you know, there's like 80 gibbonologists across the world, and it's people like me, it's researchers in universities, it's people working in NGOs, small charities who are on the ground doing rehabilitation work, saving gibbons, providing opportunities to re-habituate them back into the environment if it can be, providing opportunities for rescuing ones. So, for example, with gibbons, one of our biggest problems is they're very, very pretty. I'm not just saying that because I'm biased, but a lot of people want them as pets. So, for example, in Southeast Asia, you can go and have your photo taken with gibbons, cuddling one. You know, they actually can walk bipedally. So people want to hold their hands and have their picture taken walking down the beach in Thailand or wherever. And people have them outside restaurants and shops to try and entice people into their shops. So again, this is where we, as a tourist, can be active about, if you see that happening, contact anyone, any charity, it might be an animal rescue charity, and they will be able to put you in touch with there are always local charities on the ground who will be able to support you, and the best thing to do is look on that country's website. Some sort of International Animal Rescue, World Wildlife Fund, all of these organisations will be able to go and help shut these people down.
So, playing devil's advocate, wouldn't that be an answer of actually domesticating the gibbons, since they're going anyway? We've domesticated dogs and cats, why not the gibbons? Why can't we do the same with them and let them just be for pets, because that's the only way to keep them alive?
Well, the reality is gibbons make really, really bad pets. They have a huge territorial range. They occupy the range about they're arm swingers. So they have really, really long arms, and they spend most of the time in the upper canopy swinging around. So that's what they want to be doing. So if you take an animal like that from its natural habitat and you feed it something different, you don't allow it to swing around, you get serious mental health problems. They also have massive canines. So for example, what people usually do in the pet trade is they remove the canines because they bite you. So they don't make good pets. You're not going to be able to domesticate a gorilla or a gibbon, or in fact most vertebrates are not easy to, so animals with backbones, it's not easy to domesticate them. And so they're not going to make good pets, and most people are not going to want a gibbon pet, or they might like the idea of it, but actually feeding that animal, and is that really all we want biodiversity for a human product? So why is it that my issue is, why are humans privileged? Why should a human have greater rights than a gibbon? So there is an increasing drive, particularly amongst primatologists, for example, to have the most, could argue, intelligent ape, the chimp is our most closest relative, to have them assigned with personhood so that they have human rights status. And you might have heard this is also being applied to other natural environments. So a river has a status. So for many indigenous populations, the natural world and various natural habitats have as much meaning to them as a human being. So for example, a river in New Zealand has been given personhood status. It's been given the same rights as a human being under international treaties and laws would be given.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
No, I really do. Because it's like I was watching Interstellar, and like we were going through all of this effort, as they do in every movie. Oh, we must save the human race, and I was thinking, well, why? And it's like, because we were so keen, like with this planet, because we've ruined the planet. Let's go and find another planet to go and ruin. And it was like as soon as they were there and they made it and they were all settled, and then the first thing that happens, there's kids playing baseball and they break a window, and I think, well, you see, and it's like, well, why is it so important to save us when all we seem to do as a race is break things and ruin it?
I absolutely agree. I would far rather save gibbons than humans. But it's obviously quite controversial.
Yes.
And isn't there, going back to, like you were saying, took the gibbons out of sort of, I don't know what the word is, sort of natural environment and things. But aren't you then disturbing the whole natural cycle? They must, everything depends on something else. If you're removing that must have an effect. I don't know, maybe certain trees depend on them for their seeds, or I don't know. I'm sorry, that's a very basic way of putting it.
But you're describing an ecosystem, and that is the biggest problem is. So we're often focused on the really big fluffy animals, your tigers, your elephants, your orangutans, your gorillas, your elephants, but there's all these other, when you're getting rid of natural habitats, whether it's cutting down forests, burning them, what you're also doing is losing all the other biodiversity that doesn't seem sexy. Your bugs, in a really important area is that the soil and what lives in the soil. Obviously the actual trees and all the plant life. So many of those species are also under threat, and you're exactly right. So what that does is, removing all of this, it really upsets the whole ecosystem. Obviously when you have complete forest clearance and you just plant, for example, a rubber tree or an oil palm, all that can support is a very, very limited amount of biodiversity, a tiny fraction of the biodiversity that would have been in a natural habitat. Natural habitats isn't just tropical rainforests, of course. We've got aquatic habitats, we've got freshwater habitats, marine habitats. Exactly the same thing happens. When you lose the biodiversity loss, the quality of that habitat is really, really reduced, and nothing can survive, basically. So this is what humans have kind of failed to realise. We can keep trashing the environment, but you'll have seen there's more and more stuff now about plastic. We can't just keep producing more plastic because there is nowhere to put it. And what's happening is we're basically killing all the seas. And that means, ultimately, overfishing, marine pollution means there's less fish stock. So eventually we are going to be facing a scenario, we're already really facing it for many fish species, where the only fish you'll be able to eat is farmed fish.
Right.
So most of us are actually eating farmed fish at the minute because there simply isn't enough in naturally occurring fish, which is pretty sad.
And it's like, and I keep seeing them on Facebook where they're coming up with all these different ways of cleaning up the ocean, which is great. But then all then we're left with is this. It's still going to be a dead ocean because of all the plastic that's gone in anyway, and it's still going to. You've got to know that it's been contaminated, and even these machines that are going around and cleaning up the ocean, the machines are still ruining. It's still bringing an imbalance to the ecosystem,
and they have a tiny impact. All of these things, we're talking about. Some of these big plastic islands are often referred to in the seas, like the Pacific, they're miles long, they're huge, they're really, really massive. So all of these schemes, there are increasing schemes. There's even schemes around, plastic eating microbiota, bugs that could go in and eat plastic. But they will have a tiny impact because we have produced already so much, and our production and consumption of plastic is increasing, not decreasing.
That leads me nicely on to AI. Now, I've always been against AI because I've always said, well, what we'll do is we'll create a computer that can think for itself, and then it will take over the world, and then it will just say, it will look at things without emotion, and it will say, well, look, we're overpopulated, kill off half of the humans. How else will we do it? Brilliant. And now I'm thinking, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe we should.
I must say they're thinking, we're terrible. We're just going to wipe ourselves out, and that might be the good thing for the planet.
Absolutely, it would. I mean, there's no doubt about it. It's probably not that popular politically. I don't think many people would volunteer, would they? Sadly.
We need to sort of rate ourselves as part of the ecosystem, not the overall seers and the lords of everything.
Not take us ourselves as a priority.
Two sides of your research has got the apes, but you're also very heavily involved in the culture and health and well-being. So do you want to discuss a bit about
sure.
that?
I mean, there is overlap in that, as you've heard, I'm really interested in what might be termed natural assets, so the value of nature, but also I'm really interested in what you might call cultural assets, which is what arts and cultural assets we have in our communities. So that's partly because for 10 years when I first came to UCL, I inherited, sort of by accident, a zoology museum, the Grant Museum of Zoology, and I ended up being the curator there for 10 years. And it's an amazing collection of zoological material, animals, bits of animals from all over the world, and it's one of our fantastic museums in the university. And whilst I was there, as well as seeing the great value of the museum to our students and our staff, who really value having the opportunity to learn about biodiversity through these wonderful natural history collections, I also started working with a colleague who's the arts curator at University College Hospitals. And we just had a chat about how resources like museums might be able to be used within his hospital. So how we could take the museum into the hospital. And at this stage, many museums have not really done this. There's a lot of arts programmes in hospitals. The idea of having art on walls is obviously a fairly obvious one, but also increasingly hospitals doing things like having musicians on the wards, or having creative arts opportunities, so being able to do art making, craft activities, basket weaving happening on the wards. But the idea of museums going into hospitals or working with a health partner was sort of kind of new. This is about 15 years ago now. And so we just set up a project initially with some medical students taking the collections into hospitals, and that really got me interested in this idea of how arts and cultural resources, whether it's making art, whether it's singing, dancing from the museums, how that could benefit people. And museums have always been interested in things like social inclusion, but for the past sort of 20, 30 years, really the focus has been around education and knowledge. And I was sort of interested in thinking about, well, how does that really expand to other audiences who might be excluded, say by virtue of their health status? Maybe they've got a physical disability which prevents them coming in, maybe they've got isolation issues, maybe they've got health issues that mean they can't come into museum spaces. Is there a way that museums can work with those sorts of audiences to improve health and well-being? So for the past sort of 10 years or so, we've been doing a whole range of different projects looking at that.
think that's great. I think that's a really cool idea, and I can see how as well it does like connect in with the Gibbons, with the environment, because then it's about appreciation, and it's about it not being all the way over there, and it's about bringing it to your doorstep. And the more familiar you are with something, then the more attached you get to it. And I think, and the more you want to, now I know about these Gibbons, I want to protect them, or I want to, take my responsibility of increasing them, and sort of thing. And I think that's a great idea with the museums. I love museums. I love going and art galleries and all that. So so every opportunity of bringing it to everyone, I think that's a great idea.
It goes back to being more aware about being part of a bigger thing as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And bringing your history in and sort of all those sort of things, sort of learning more about.
Well, that idea of a sort of people might have heard of a big society, and that idea that what we all know is the NHS, social care, local authorities, their budgets are under massive pressure. So everybody's heard about waiting lists in hospitals, referral times, and that we're not. The health service is buckling. It cannot meet the demand of people needing to use it. So we really need to look beyond those services to think about how people can support their own health and well-being.
Yes.
So we're talking both about prevention, but also remedial, like we talked about within hospital spaces. But increasingly places like museums, art galleries, art centres, and individual practitioners, artists, creative people really want to, I think, expand and share their knowledge and passion for arts and creative activities to help support people. So we work with everybody from older adults who are isolated, who've maybe never been to museums or an art centre, through to stroke survivors, people with dementia, mental health service users, and most of the sorts of audiences we work with are people who would never visit a cultural venue. It wouldn't be part of their everyday life. But what we've shown, our research and other people's research in this area around arts and health have shown, is that when those sorts of vulnerable and marginalised audiences engage with creative activities, you actually see real tangible benefits. Their health and well-being is improved on multiple levels, both physically and psychologically. So these provide real, what I refer to as non-clinical interventions in health, and increasingly organisations like the NHS and Public Health England, who support health and social care, they're increasingly looking to us and our cultural assets and saying, this is really interesting, because what people like Sir Michael Marmot at UCL have shown is that there's a massive social inequality to health. Where you live really has a major part to play, and the resources in your communities. So if you're in a really poor area that has very few community assets, that includes things like community centres, museums, public spaces, green spaces, if you've got very few of those resources, you automatically have much lower health. So what we know is if you're in an area that has more of those assets, and those assets like museums, libraries, green spaces, parks, if they are being deployed, if they're being used better by the community, you are automatically going to have better health, irrespective of whether your employment status, your socioeconomic status. So you can still be born and live on a council estate, but if you've got those sorts of resources in your community, you will automatically be healthier. So that is really amazing.
A big impact
to know that if you engage in those activities, irrespective of your actual background, your educational status, you will be healthier.
Right. So if you've got a cold, go to the museum.
Absolutely. Don't do anything contagious. Definitely don't. But definitely for supporting, particularly all stages of the life, but particularly for people if they're facing personal challenges, things like isolation, mental health issues, but also people who have maybe faced particular challenges. So like, the work we've done with stroke survivors, it's been really interesting working with occupational therapists, where they've looked at the kind of activities you do when you're doing a creative task, and they have said they are the same but better than some of the sorts of tasks that they would get stroke survivors to do for rehabilitation. So we're increasingly looking at how these sorts of tasks could be deployed in clinical settings or in community settings to support, for example, cognitive stimulation for dementia, physical stimulation, and particular things like fine motor control. So, when you're doing really fine tasks with your hand, it could be doing knitting or needlework or art making, handling. We do a lot of work around handling museum objects because, again, these tasks require, for example, really specific hand-eye coordination.
Yeah.
And these are exactly the kind of things that happen in occupational rehabilitation therapies.
Right.
But they're much more fun. People like those tasks more than buttoning and unbuttoning a shirt, or tying and untying shoelaces, or putting the kettle on, which are the sorts of tasks that people are given. You mentioned learning, and that's what people always cite. So all of our research, that's one of the biggest things. No matter what stage, even working with people towards the end of their life, people with severe dementias, they will still articulate, they'll still say, what I really loved about this activity was learning something new, whether it's a new skill, a new task, or just new knowledge that they've absorbed and taken on board themselves. And that kind of agency that arts and creative activities have, I think, is really, really important, because again, it's like you were talking about in terms of being empowered yourself to do something, that makes you feel better. It genuinely makes you feel better, even if you are very, very unwell. So we still take museum objects into the cancer centre, working with teenagers and young people, and just that opportunity to engage with something other than their clinical interventions, their clinical
and when you're in hospital, there is so much time, and then it's
bringing a bit of light to them, isn't it?
And to use the time more positively rather than focusing on being ill.
Absolutely, really, really important.
Wow.
I read is it the report, the National Alliance for Museums, Health and Wellbeing? That's an amazing report. I was reading through it, and all the different examples and all the different areas you're covering, just all the different museums that are involved. One of the ones that I was looking at was the sex education for the teenagers going in and look at like chastity belts. That's gonna put you off. It was a really good, interesting report. And it was fascinating.
And that's the thing. In the last 10 years, when we first started this research, there was no museums that were really doing this work. And our very first research project. That was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which was a bit bizarre for a biologist to apply there, but they were very generous and have supported us ever since. We got lots of museums who we still work with now, but they had never done this sort of work, but were really enthusiastic about it. And since that time, now we would, our most recent report from the National Alliance, it shows evidence that probably most museums in the UK are doing this sort of work. That's an amazing resource. We've got 2,500 museums in the UK.
Wow.
And these are great, spaces for communities. And the biggest chance that museums have is to attract audiences that wouldn't normally go into those spaces. And most museums are really proactive about wanting to work with vulnerable members of their community, getting a big diversity of their community to come into their spaces and do cool stuff, or go out to them. Going out to museums and working a lot with charities like Mind, the Alzheimer's Society, Age UK, lots of organisations and local charities, to think how they can work together better to support communities.
Right. So I know, because of course when I was at school we used to go to the museums a lot. Are there plans to sort of take, or do they happen already, where the museums are going to the schools? So I think it's something that you catch them early.
Well, that's already been going on for years. So that was actually the biggest area of museum work, I guess, for the last 20, 30 years, has been schools orientated. So like you say, it's school visits coming into museums, and school museums going out and doing things like loan boxes, taking collections out into schools. And there is some evidence that of course, that has a small local effect on that day, that I think the kids have a great time and they learn something new, and they definitely learn in a more creative way. The biggest issues with that is the capacity that, just having a one-off visit to a museum isn't going to change your behaviour. It's not going to make you, it's highly unlikely to make the majority of people suddenly think, great, I'm going to go to my museum every week. And in a way, what we need is a much more linked up programme of how schools, how individuals, how community centres, how they are linking up with things like museums. And that's sort of happening through what's called social prescribing. And this is the idea of referral pathways. So if you go and see your GP, or you've got a social worker, those sorts of people who are capable of referring you on, instead of referring you on for a standard clinical intervention, so like a drug or a particular therapy, that they would instead think about what else is in the community that might support you. So obviously one of the biggest issues that facing the UK society is obesity and diabetes. That largely comes down to behaviours around what you eat and your exercise routine. And these are again where places like museums, where green spaces like your parks. So what we're increasingly seeing is referrers like that being interested in thinking about how, instead of monitoring people's diabetes, giving them the same pamphlets and leaflets produced by Public Health England about don't eat so much sugar, don't eat so much fat,
like they didn't know
which
that
then
before.
they don't. Yeah, well, many people don't. And that is important, but is that the best way to get it? Because then you get a leaflet and you shove it in your bag and you go away and buy a bun again. Buy more cupcakes. But what increasingly is recognised that if you are part of the sorts of activities we've just been talking about, something that is engaging and fun, often social, and you're going and doing an activity like that is quite physical, that is maybe cognitively and mentally stimulating, and most importantly, you're enjoying it, you are much more likely to do that activity on a repeated basis, which is likely to have an impact on your health. And this is called social prescribing. So what we're seeing is across many local authorities, many communities, is that health referrers who are using these sorts of pathways, the most common is exercise on referral, and that can be, you might have heard of green gyms, you might even have seen them, people in green spaces jumping up and down, and they may well have been referred to that by a health professional, which is saying, you know, you've got a weight problem, or you've got an issue with diabetes, or for example mental health is another big area. So we're seeing, you know, exercise on prescription for people with mental health problems, hiking on prescription, use of green spaces, and increasingly what we're seeing is things like arts on prescription. We've just developed a scheme called Museums on Prescription, which is working around isolation and loneliness. Using these assets and saying that if these organisations can be delivering these sorts of programmes and activities to target specific public health problems, that is a massive benefit for the individual, because we can see better progression on those programmes than we can with standard health interventions, and those individuals enjoy them better because they engage with them. So we're seeing genuine behaviour change. And what we really need at this level is the kinds of data to support that, to show that we see those changes at a population level. But the NHS are really, you know, they've been brought into this. They've just appointed a national lead for social prescribing, and Bev is going to be looking at this across the whole of the NHS to think about how we could link better with these what are called community-based assets. So assets in the community that you can prescribe to, other than your usual clinical or health referrals.
Excellent.
So, did you always want to be sort of Professor Gibbons and go in this area, or how did you lead up into this in your career?
I suppose I'd always loved engaging with the natural. I'd always loved going hiking and always loved being in the outdoors. And I was, I guess, always interested very broadly in biology. That's what I love about biology. It can accommodate somebody like me who has a very broad spectrum of interest, from the natural world through to the built world, like museums and cultural assets. So I always knew I wanted to do that, but I suppose I kind of fell in love with primates when I was doing my masters. So I did my degree and I was actually going to do a PhD on paleontology, working on a very specific group of kind of bug-like arthropods. And I thought, do I really want to do that? Interesting looking at fossils, but what will I end up doing? Is that a good career? And then I was doing my masters and started learning about the diversity of primates and primate evolution as part of my masters. My masters was in paleoanthropology, so the kind of history of humans and our closest relatives, the primates. I got to do things like dissection. That, you know, really changed my view of the world, the idea of how the body is formed, particularly at the musculoskeletal end, and that's what got me interested in Gibbons, because they just have an amazing anatomy. They have really, really long arms, and they have a load of specialisations in their body, in their anatomy, which allow them to do this really amazing arm swinging locomotion. I mean, people have described them as the ballet dancers of the trees. They also have these amazing singing voices.
I didn't know that at all.
They have, and they're species specific, so each species has its own call, and it's just it's been described. But it's very. I mean, I can't really do it, but it sort of sounds like. You can look it up on the internet and you'll find a plethora of sound. But they are actually really beautiful, and they have apparently, I don't really know much much about music or opera in this sense, but they have the same vocal range as opera singers, if not broader. So no other species can reach the vocal range. So the sorts of notes that they can hit at all levels of the spectrum are equivalent, if not more, than humans. And no other species is able to achieve that. So it's really a beautiful sound.
Wow.
I didn't
So go and listen to them.
I'm going to go away and have a listen. That's amazing.
So do you go away on a lot of expeditions to actually observe them in their habitat?
I don't. I mean, I do some of that, but most of my time is spent looking at the sorts of data. It doesn't sound as exciting as my students go and get to do the fun stuff like that. But a lot of my work is more at the kinds of data and information that you can extract information about where they live, their environment, and that involves looking at museum collections. Obviously that's how I got into it, so I worked a lot with museum collections. So often, sadly, with many of these species, they're actually only represented now in great numbers in museum collections, dead in a museum collection. So what those data can tell us, though, is where those animals used to live at that time when the collections were collected. And then fossils, of course, can tell us where those animals lived at that time. And so what you can do is look at how the animal's range has changed over time, and then look at, well, what things made it change? What were those drivers that made the ranges change? And in the past, it was very much environmental drivers, like climate change. In Southeast Asia, for example, there was a lot of climate change happened over the past sort of 5 million years, partly because there was a lot of plates, tectonic plates colliding, and sea level was changing lots, and there was uplifts of mountains happening, and all of this had really big effects on the environment, on things like rainfall, on things like where the sea level was. So there was land bridges between some of the islands in Southeast Asia, so animals could actually cross areas that they now can't cross. So a lot of my work has been focused on looking at how you can use the sorts of data from museum collections, from actual specimens, and from the animals, where the animals live now, to think about what the factors are that are changing. And that's, I guess, been the saddest thing for me, because that's what I started out doing 20 years ago. And in that time, what we now know about the levels of devastation that humans have caused has far outstripped any environmental impact, because it's of the rapidity that humans are destroying the landscape. Or even, when hunting and poaching happens, it's not just one or two individuals. People will go into the forests and they'll be taking 10, 20, 30 individuals, if not more at a time. So, you might have seen some horrific pictures of, pangolins, which have been scaly anteaters. Really, really cute, really unusual anatomy, and their products are wanted across various countries. And people will go in, literally hundreds of animals at a time on a daily basis, and there will be truckloads of pangolins being exported illegally across the world. So the trade in wildlife and wildlife products is apparently the third biggest trade illegally, along with things like arms and people. So weapons and people and wildlife. So that's where you've heard about all the ivory stuff. These things it's poaching on massive scales. It's not just one or two individuals. It's hundreds and hundreds of individuals at a time. And if you're already talking about populations that are surviving at very low numbers, these sorts of levels of poaching and levels of hunting, along with habitat destruction, just has a massive impact, unfortunately.
Maybe it's about stepping back and taking, like how we've done with the museums, and looking at it, let's make this application here, let's look at it in a completely different way. Maybe it's like setting the law, making it illegal. Maybe that's
already illegal. All of this stuff is illegal.
But then it hasn't stopped it. And if anything, has it increased it? Because then the thing that's illegal is even more rare. So, no, there's even more then. Let's get more of it, because I'll make even more money on the black market than before. So maybe is it a way of looking at it? Well, let's look at it as more of a economic thing. And how do we make it, I don't know,
sort of less valuable, less.
I think you're absolutely right. I think in a way I'm the wrong person to be doing this sort of work. In a way it needs to be economists and politicians. I think you're absolutely right, because it's about consumerism.
Right.
And it's about economic growth. So what you need is economists and politicians. You don't need people
Yeah.
like me who are just there flying the flag going, stop killing your gibbons.
Yeah, we care, yeah.
You know, we're the wrong people, but it's how you get those people on board. How do you get people to say economic growth is a bad thing?
Right.
Most people are not going to say that
Have
actually.
you got anybody that in that field is engaging with?
I mean, yes, many countries, particularly in Scandinavia, for example, will talk not necessarily about growth, but more about, because a lot of people talk about growth in terms of social inequalities. It's a way of, for example, you know, if you look at countries like China and India, economically they are growing at a really rapid rate, and that's been to the benefit of many people. But what you also see is it's also to the detriment of many, many more people. So what you see is with massive economic growth, a greater social divide.
Yeah.
So the health inequalities, social inequalities are much, much greater. So yes, you might get many, many more rich people, but you also get even larger numbers of very poor people.
Right.
And that's what we're not really tackling at the minute, and that's what I think governments. There isn't a political will at the minute to think about that, how that translates to sustainable economic growth. It is that thing of everyone can do something, you know. Everyone can, you know, there is a sense of increasingly in the West, but people are very self-obsessed. Everyone's taking selfies, and rather than thinking about community and the environment and thinking about other people, and when you think about other people, that includes for me other Gibbons, other members of the community. And so having that, you know, you can make changes to your lifestyle. Like you became vegan, I mean, that was an amazing step. And we know that, for example, being vegetarian or vegan is much, much more environmentally friendly.
The primates and also the well-being in the museums, it's just incredible. So it's brilliant. Thank you ever so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much to everyone for listening. We'll put links up on our website, which is www.antiwafflepodcast.wordpress.com, and it will be on our Twitter account, which is @antiwafflepod. Please do get in touch, as we'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.